Many, many moons ago now, back when I was a college kid with a bright future ahead of me, I volunteered as a trail guide at the Mikalsen County wilderness area down in southeast Oklahoma. Having grown up on the ranch my pa worked at, I'd always been an outdoorsy kind of guy. Not a cowboy by any stretch, but I knew which end of the bullets came out of a rifle. And I think I'd have been happy working on that ranch too, if only to stay close to family. But my pa always did want more for me, so when the time came, I decided to make him proud by becoming a lawyer. I studied at Texas A&M, then while I was there, I heard about the volunteer program. It wasn't offering any extra credit, but the university would pay my expenses, so it amounted to a sort of free spring break vacation in my native Oklahoma. The county wilderness area was a real hidden gem, with about 14,000 acres of rugged Ouachita mountain terrain stretching right up to the Arkansas state line. It's got the thick pine forest with cool, clean creeks running through them, and then all kinds of wildlife too, like deer and turkeys and the occasional black bear. It's a prime spot for hiking, fishing, all that kind of stuff. But some folks don't feel entirely comfortable out in the wilderness all alone, and that's where I came in. Now, I led groups on trails like the Beach Creek Loop or up to the overlooks to point out the native plant and bird species, along with a little Choctaw history since their roots are deep around those parts. And for the most part, all my trips out into the wilderness, including my solo ones, went perfectly fine. But then there was this one trip that I made back in the summer of 1995 that I'll never forget, and the reason that I'm writing you. I used to do a bunch of different things as a trail guide, not just guide people, and one of my favorites was what amounted to a sort of campsite scouting. We'd host a lot of overnight camping trips, mostly for younger or older folks, so we needed tried and tested places to take our guests. For example, you needed a piece of flat, solid ground large enough for at least 4 or 5 tents. It couldn't be in a low spot either, where rain could pool up and turn your site into a swamp after one of those quick Ouachita storms. The ground had to be nice and clear, with no overhead widowmakers either, and by that I mean dead branches or leaning trees that could crash down in a wind gust. And seeing as we were in bear country, scanning for scat, tracks, or fresh diggings were more important too, and if a place seemed active, I just moved on, because a bear encounter was not something I was willing to risk. And then once you had a spot close to water with a place for a good fire pit, it was marked on the map before being field tested, as it were. And that field testing involved one of us heading out to the proposed site and staying there overnight. On the occasion that I'm about to speak on, I was asked to check out a potential campsite around the area called He Creek. He Creek was a runoff of the Mountain Fork River and was about an 8 to 9 hour hike from where we were based. We didn't have many campsites in that area, and I agreed that we could find better ones that we already had, especially in a place with intersecting bodies of water and such varied topography. And it took me all day to get out there, and that's after hitting the trails at 7 a.m., but once I arrived, I soon found a sweet little vacation on a rise but flat peninsula which overlooked the river. It was perfect for fishing and hunting, and ideal for families with kids too, since the creek was ankle deep and the river moved nice and slow. And the only thing left to do was set up my little one-man tent, get a fire going, and see what the night brought me. I hadn't seen any bear or cougar scat, which was a big plus, but out in the wilds of southeast Oklahoma, it's not just the obvious creatures that you gotta be wary of. We've been known to get an alligator or two in the marshier regions of the southeast, and while bobcats and coyotes can be a treat to small children, rampaging herds of feral hogs pose a danger to just about anything that gets in their way, large vehicles included. And so the whole idea of staying out there overnight is to get a real feel for the place, since it's at night when the wilds really come alive. And after easily putting together a campfire, thanks to the abundance of firewood in the area, I made myself a campfire dinner and then took to reading some Call of the Wild by Headlamp. I'd read it before, but I figured that there was no better paperback for a night in the wilderness, and I'd just gotten to one of my favorite passages. Quote, "He was beaten, but he was not broken," etc., when I heard a noise about 20 to 30 yards away through the trees. I don't spook easily, and I spent enough nights outdoors to know nights can be noisy, so since all you normally need to do with an animal is let them know that you're there, all I said was, "Howdy, y'all," as I looked up from my book. Now, I didn't hear any more movement after that, for a couple of minutes anyway, so I figured maybe it was just a dead branch falling from a tree. But it wasn't long before I heard it again, and that time, it was even closer. Someone or something was moving through the darkness, getting closer and closer to me with each passing minute. And so I did what any other right-minded person might do in that situation, and I reached for my gun. Now, I carried a Super Red Hawk, but in a .480 Ruger, so I had a little less recoil. Now, it was very much my choice sidearm for those oh crap moments, so I was confident that I could put down whatever charged at me. My only worry was that it wasn't an animal, and whoever was out there was similarly armed as myself. So on the off chance that that was the case, I remembered saying, "You gotta be real brave or real stupid to be sneaking up on someone who's camping after dark." Now, it served as a dual purpose, making it clear to an animal that I wasn't going anywhere, and clear to a person that I wasn't some pushover. And then when I heard the sound again just beyond the light of my campfire, sounding like it was coming from behind a nearby tree, I cocked the hammer of my Red Hawk and aimed for its trunk. My hands were shaking as I tried my best to focus on getting my breathing right, so when whatever it was came around the tree trunk, I was ready for it. But then, just as I managed to get my heart rate just a little less frantic, I heard the sound of fast-moving footsteps just off to my right. Whoever it was so fast that I didn't even have time to turn and aim at him, not without giving him a clear shot at me with whatever kind of blade he was holding. I didn't get a good look at it, but I saw it shining in the firelight as he came at me, and it gave me no choice but to basically dive over my own tent in order to put something between us. I heard him yell something as he took a single swing at me, and then by the time I was up on one knee, I only saw the back of him lit up by the campfire as he ran off into the trees again, and I wasn't about to let him get away. So I aimed, steadied myself, and then took a single Hail Mary shot at him. And that bang was so loud it had my ears ringing, and I hoped to hear him scream before tumbling into the dirt, but there was nothing. Just the faint sound of heavy footsteps as whoever it was fleeing the area. I spent the rest of that night watching my own campsite from a distance, just watching and waiting for whoever attacked me to return. Packing up and heading back wasn't really an option, as it'd give whoever was out there a really good opportunity to track my movement on account of how noisy moving around at night can be. But it also raises the question of how the hell did that person manage to approach my camp so quietly, and why the heck would a person try and murder a complete stranger like that in the middle of a wilderness area? At dawn, once it was light enough to see, I walked off in the direction my attacker had run following the encounter and quickly found a trail of blood. I followed it for quite a distance, moving slowly and quietly with my pistol at the ready until I reached a small, chest-height cave set into a rock face. It went deep, but I only went in for enough to see where the blood trail ended, and there were all kinds of animal bones in there. Random pieces of camping trash too, like empty cans and plastic water bottles. But unless they were hiding at the very rear of the cave, seeing my flashlight and keeping quiet as a mouse, I don't figure anyone was in there at that time. I got back to the compound about 9 hours later in the mid-afternoon. I went straight to my boss, told him what happened, and that's why they stopped taking camping parties up near He Creek. The local sheriff said that he'd keep an ear to the ground and I was well within my right to shoot at him, but in all likelihood, they probably wouldn't find the guy with so little to go on. Now, I'm not sure if they found the blood trail and took a sample or whatever they might do. Hell, I'm not even sure they sent anyone out there at all, really. But it just goes to show you that even when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, it's not just the bears you gotta worry about. It's the men. I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, but I drifted out west in my teens, ended up getting hooked on heroin, and then spent a little time in federal prison for something I'm not too proud of. Probably goes without saying, but that was rock bottom for me. I made it through without taking any kind of beating, but when I got out, I knew I had to get myself together. For the first time in my life, I had to think about what I wanted to do with myself. I knew I liked being outside, even more so after my stretch in prison, but I knew the chances of me becoming a park or forest ranger as a felon were slim to none. I knew I could try out to be one of those wilderness firefighters because they allow felons to apply if their convictions weren't for violent crimes. But then after stopping at a bar for a couple of beers one Thursday night, I ended up talking to a guy whose cousin operated a tour company out in the Pasayten wilderness. I told him my story over those couple of beers, all the honest-to-God's truth, too, no bullcrap. And when I was done, he asked if I was interested in being a tour guide. And then since it involved walking the trails all day, sometimes even camping out overnight, I only had 2 words for him: hell and yes. I got a call the next day from my future boss asking if I was okay interning for a couple of months so I could prove that I was on the level. He'd give me a place to stay, make sure I was fed, watered, and washed, but while he didn't mind taking a chance on me, he didn't want to pay for the privilege. I didn't tell him this, but at the time, I think I'd have happily worked for a whole year for free if it meant having my dream job at the end of it. So I accepted his offer, and then made my way to a small town up in the hills called Barron. I honestly had no idea what to expect, but when I arrived, I found the place was way more comfortable than I ever expected. There were 4 other guides staying up there, not including the boss who lived down in Wilthrop, and they each shared a cabin that had full amenities. There were 3 of them, so I got one all to myself for a while. I knew it was only because the other guides didn't trust me, and probably because the boss had warned them that I was an ex-con, but they were nice enough, so I didn't mind having to earn their trust and respect over time. I really didn't know what to expect from the clientele either, but they proved to be a real mixed bag. You'd get your tourists and your adventure vacation types, who you're only there to make sure that they didn't get lost or wander anywhere they shouldn't. And then there were the corporate team builders or the bachelor parties who were more party than peace. And I fell into the rhythm of that place pretty quickly and started making friends pretty quickly too once people saw how serious I was about it. And then once my trial period was up and I was a fully trained and fully paid up member of the guiding team, I was able to head out with parties all on my own and sometimes for a night or 2 of camping. And that's how I ended up meeting a family of 4 headed up by an older lady named Patty. Patty and her husband must have been in their 60s, maybe early 70s, and they had their 2 grown-up kids with them. They decided to spend a little time in the great outdoors together on account of raising their 2 grown-up kids on concrete, and right away, I could tell that they were going to be great guests. They were just about as wholesome a family unit as it was possible to get, at least in my opinion anyway. They clearly loved each other very much, but they were real funny too, and the way they went at it with each other had me laughing along with them. They were interesting folks too and had some amazing stories to share, so it was one of those parties that was such a pleasure to guide that if I was a millionaire, I would have happily guided them for free. And so we hiked all day, stopped for breaks here and there, until we reached our campsite for the night. I got us a fire going with the help of Patty's grown-up son, then she insisted on doing all the campfire cooking so I could relax and take a load off. We had 2 tents with us, one for the parents, one for the kids, and a reminder that they are grown-up people, and then my small one-man pup tent. We got them all set up, went over a few emergency procedures in case anything happened in the night, and then each went to our sleeping bags for the evening. But what I didn't know, what I could never have known, was just how wrong things were going to go for us during the next day's hike. I remember waking up to the sound of voices and being blinded by flashlights when I looked out of my tent. There, standing outside their tents in what amounted to their nighttime wear, were Patty's husband, son, and daughter, but there was no Patty anywhere to be seen. The 3 of them were whispering at first, but when they heard me asking what was going on, they told me that Patty was missing. Her husband said that he woke up to noises beside him in the tent, but figured his wife was just rolling over in her sleep or something. And then when he asked if she was okay and he didn't hear any reply, he realized that not only was the tent's front flap unzipped, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. Patty's husband then takes a walk around outside for her just to make sure that she really is off taking a leak somewhere. And then when a couple of minutes went by and she hadn't returned, he woke up his kids. And that's when they realized that Patty hadn't even put her shoes on. We briefly discussed the procedure for someone going missing, and so after a quick reminder, we each walked off in a different compass direction with our flashlights and then started yelling out Patty's name. We kept each other's flashlights in view and we didn't go too far, but we kept on yelling her name as loud as we could, and when we didn't get any response, we kept on pushing outwards a little more until we were maybe 100 meters apart on all sides. We yelled and kept on yelling, but still didn't hear a thing from Patty in response. And since I didn't want anyone wandering off and getting lost, I called out for everyone to return to camp. I planned on contacting the local rangers and enlisting their help while I got the family back to headquarters, but Patty's son didn't like that idea at all. A small argument broke out between myself and the son, who insisted that we stay and keep on looking. Now, she was an older lady, so she couldn't have gotten far, I think, and while I agreed, we had certain protocols to follow in the event of someone going missing like that, and those protocols were based on keeping everyone else in a group safe. Yet Patty's husband agreed with their son and insisted that they stay at the camp and keep calling out her name in case she got lost, and so she could find her way back to the camp. I had to work with them. I had to at least give them some hope in that respect, and honestly, because that's the exact same thing I hope someone might do for me if that was my mom out there lost in the dark forest. And so, while I started to pack up our stuff, I told Patty's son that I wouldn't stop him if he wanted to take one last look around the perimeter. And as you can imagine, he was grateful for my cooperation, but I also get the feeling that he'd have punched me right in the face if I had insisted on leaving. And so off he went, him and his dad, while I tried my best to keep Patty's daughter calm as I packed away my gear and got a start on the group stuff too. I didn't think they'd find anything. I hope they did, but the wilderness makes you a cynic over time on account of how cruel nature can truly be. And so imagine how surprised and relieved I was when, maybe 10 minutes after they left, I heard the sound of the son's voice coming through the trees as he yelled, "We got her." Patty's daughter burst into tears when she saw her dad and brother approaching with their mom in tow, and I'm not ashamed to say that I wasn't far from tears myself by that point. I'd never had to deal with anything like that before, so to have it over and done with so quickly was an incredible relief. Patty seemed really shaken as we checked her over for injuries, and while her son kept asking what happened, where did you go, she didn't seem to have an answer for them. When she did talk, she just kept saying, "I don't know. I can't remember. I think I got lost." And that all kind of made sense to me once I realized that she'd walked off without a flashlight because it gets so oppressively dark at night out in the wilderness that it can get really disorienting and frightening very quickly. And I remember telling everyone not to worry, that Patty would probably be more articulate once she'd gotten some sleep and some food, and we were all pretty exhausted by that point. But even after a few hours of sleep and some protein bars and coffee for breakfast, things continued to get worse. To stay on schedule, we could only get a couple of more hours of sleep before we had to wake up, pack up, and make our way back to HQ, and that meant that we were all kind of tired and cranky waking up at 6:30 a.m., but still super relieved that we'd found Patty and avoided any major disasters. I made that coffee, handed out those bars, and while I did, I noticed that Patty was still unusually quiet, especially in comparison to what a chatty Patty she was the day before. I didn't press her too much on it. I just asked if she was feeling okay and was good to walk back to base, and she said sure after apologizing for scaring us. She seemed like her usual self, or at least the usual self that I'd come to know in those 24 hours, but there was something, I don't know, missing. Like she was still a little confused or spooked regarding what had happened that night. And like I said, I didn't press her on it, as I figured that she was probably dealing with a lot of mixed emotions at that point. But as we got back to the trail and started heading back to HQ, Patty's behavior took a series of dramatic turns, and very much for the worst. I think we were maybe 20 minutes into the hike, and it was a nice quiet morning too, so you could hear a pin drop whenever the birds weren't tweeting. Now I'm leading the group. The two grown-up kids are behind me while Patty and her husband are at the rear, and I could hear them whispering to each other, Not to keep secrets or anything, just to preserve that early morning calm. But then at one point, I hear Patty's husband say something like, "What did you say? In fact, you know what? Don't. We'll talk about this later." Now, he didn't raise his voice or anything, he just sounded irritated, and since it's my general policy not to intervene until tempers start to flare too badly, I didn't even acknowledge what was said. It's not entirely unusual for folks to get a little snippy with each other, especially when they're tired and out of their comfort zones. And generally speaking, the best course of action is to not escalate, i.e. don't get involved. Little tips like that generally smooth themselves out, as no one wants to have a big family or inter-friend argument in front of the trail guide. But not in this case, not at all. It must have only been a couple of minutes later that I heard Patty's husband behind me say something like, "I told you, Patty, this is not the time. We can talk about this later." To which she replied, and these were her exact words, "We'll talk about it, and then we'll go running off into the arms of one of your whores." Now, both her grown-up kids gasped and were like, "Mom? What the hell?" Now, I felt the exact same way, having seen this sweet old lady go from a ray of sunshine the day before to having a mouth like a damned sewer rat the day after. I mean, that probably sounds a little rich coming from someone who curses up a storm every now and then, but my point stands. Something about Patty was way different, and even with all that crap I've been through in my life, I found the change to be very unsettling. She started off on some rant about how her husband wasn't faithful, how he hadn't been so for years, and he thought that she was dumb for not knowing, but she knew. I remember the husband snapping at her and then yelling, "Patty, I told you, this is not the time." And that silenced her, and I turned to tell them all very politely to just keep moving as fast as they could so we could get them back to base on schedule. I remember turning around and walking backwards while I said it, and considering what she just said, I expected Patty to have a face like thunder. Only she didn't. Quite the opposite, actually. She was sort of smiling, ear to ear. And that was the point where I turned to Patty's son and asked him to drop back a little so I could talk with him in private. And then with his sister now at the lead, we dropped back a ways behind his parents and got to talking. Now, he was understandably on edge, but even more so that we talked because I told him strange turns in behavior like that could be caused by some pretty serious head injuries. And he knew that all too well himself, as I think he was some kind of personal injury specialist, but here's the stickler. Patty didn't show any sign whatsoever of having any kind of head injury. We checked her pretty much all over the night before, especially her scalp, because her hair does a real good job of hiding bumps, cuts, and bruises, especially when those cuts aren't bleeding particularly heavy. But like I said, there was nothing, not even so much as a bump on her head. That didn't mean that she'd taken some kind of fall, but regardless, she needed to be taken to a hospital and checked out for anything that we might have missed. He agreed, and then said the first thing that they'd do once we got back to HQ was drive her to the nearest hospital. But as it turned out, we didn't make it back there at all. As we kept on hiking, Patty started getting very snippy and mean again, but this time it was directed at her kids. Now, I couldn't believe my damn ears as some of the stuff that she was saying. Now, it sounded like she was dragging up age-old fights and wrongdoings, but then from the reaction of her kids, she was putting a particularly venomous and untrue spin on things. Such as one point she accused her son of selling pot in college, and he just about exploded, saying something along the lines of, "No, I did not. I got high like one time, Mom. One time. I could be disbarred if people heard you talking about this." Now, she said something really mean to her daughter too, but I'm not sure that I could say what that was without, if this ever makes it to a video on YouTube, it might get nuked, you know? And I mean, it's not even worth typing out for you to decide which part needs to be removed, because all of it was about as poisonous as you could possibly imagine. I mean, imagine the worst stuff you could ever accuse a woman of, and that's what Patty's mom was accusing her daughter of. It was so bad that the daughter burst into tears as she asked her why she was acting the way she was, and then just kept going on like that until Patty's husband yelled at her to shut the hell up. It all got so bad that I had to step in and ask them to calm down, and I never do that unless things get really, really bad. The daughter was in tears, the son looked next to traumatized, and Patty's husband had turned so red that he looked like a tomato in hiking gear. But Patty, you guessed it, she's just there smiling ear to ear, like what she'd said and the reactions it had gotten was the most amusing and satisfying thing in the world to her. Now, I was so alarmed by it that I asked her, very nice and polite, if she could just refrain from starting arguments until I'd at least gotten them safely back. Now, most folks don't want to argue in front of their guide, and they tend to treat me as a kind of neutral party too. But on this occasion, that formerly sweet old lady looked me dead in the eyes, told me to shut the F up before she got her husband to knock my teeth out. Well, everything exploded again. The daughter cried, the son comforted her, and the husband started really roaring at Patty, asking what the hell had gotten into her that she'd say something like that. Now, he turned to me and said, "I'll do nothing like that, Devin, rest assured." But then turned back to Patty and started screaming at her again. And I had to seriously step in that time and ask everyone to just calm down before things escalated even further. I didn't even know what the escalation might even look like. I just knew that I didn't want to see it. But I don't think I've ever expected things to happen the way they did, because after another period of silence, after calming everyone down, I was at the lead when I heard Patty's husband scream my name. I turned around to see her with a rock in her hand, a big one, and from the looks of things, she was trying to smash her husband in the face with it. Everyone jumped up in to stop it, as in me, the son, and the daughter, while Patty's husband looked so shocked that his face turned from that deep red to an almost bright pale white instantly. Her son grabbed her, her daughter pulled the rock out of her hand, and then they actually took her down to the ground as really carefully and gently as they could, which in fairness wasn't all that gentle considering that she was kicking and flailing and even trying to bite them at one point. I told Patty's husband to just keep her where she was, no matter what. Don't let her run off into the woods and get lost again. He was really shaken, but assured me that she wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. And so after dropping my pack and telling them that I'd return as quickly as possible, I ran off in the direction of headquarters, keeping a steady jogging pace until I arrived back maybe 20 to 25 minutes later. I felt ready to puke up my own lungs by the time I stopped running, and I had to spend maybe a minute catching my breath before I could actually describe the situation that was happening back on the trail. We had an ATV with a Medlight transport trailer attached, which are those gurney things that you see attached to them so injured people can be moved around off-road. And so after a coworker grabbed the keys, I rode back to where Patty and her family were. I was terrified things had gotten even worse in my absence, but while things seemed to have calmed down a little, Patty's condition hadn't improved any. It had actually gotten worse. She was still in the ground when we arrived, but she wasn't being restrained by her kids anymore. Instead, she looked exhausted, and there was a little puddle of puke nearby where she'd been vomiting. All that venom seemed to have left her, too, because when I asked her if she was awake, all she'd say was, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." And that was all perfectly normal sounding, to go up and down like that, I mean. They call them mood swings for a reason, right? And that only further convinced me that Patty was suffering the effects of some kind of head injury that we didn't know about. But then Patty's son took me aside, and with a sort of scared look on his face, he says, "I think she's losing her mind, man." Now, I reassured him that that probably wasn't what was happening, and that people don't just lose their minds like that after getting lost in the woods for a brief period of time. But he still needed to rush her to a hospital once they were able to do so, and with that, he agreed wholeheartedly. But he did say something that frightened me too, and that was how she hadn't responded when he called her Mom. Patty's son described how after asking her something along the lines of, "Mom, are you feeling any better?" she acted like she was ignoring him. And he got kind of mad and then says, "Don't just ignore me, Mom." But then she looked at him from where she was laying with this very confused look on her face. And it was like he had to remind her that's who she was to him, his mom, and after that she just kept apologizing and saying she could remember where she was. And even now I find all that very confusing because while that's all still consistent with someone receiving a major head injury, an injury like that would not have been difficult to detect. So the fact that there was no blood in her hair from a gash or a big lump where she'd suffer a nasty impact to make her concussed, it made no sense to us at all. Once I told them what happened, everyone back at headquarters agreed that it was best to contact EMS, And then since we were way out in the sticks and Patty's condition seemed really serious, they ended up sending out an air ambulance. Now, I've never seen a helicopter hover so low before, but I didn't exactly have time to enjoy it either. I was scared for Patty, and I felt so terrible for her husband and 2 kids who, as you can imagine, were in a really bad way by the time the helicopter showed up. All I could do was tell them that I'd be praying for them and that our doors were always open to them, and then after they drove off, that was the end of it. We didn't hear anything more about Patty or what happened to her that night on the trail, but we didn't forget it, especially not me. Time went by, but I found myself just thinking about Patty on a daily basis and without fail. Anytime I was out in the trails, especially when the day got close to being done, I'd picture her waking up, climbing out of her tent and just wandering off in the darkness in her bare feet. We could understand her putting her boots on and walking off to go urinate somewhere, but walking off without them seemed to suggest that she was either really scared of something or just wanted to run, or she was in some kind of trance. Now, they call it a fugue state in psychology. You may have heard of it, and me and the other guides have talked about it at length. It's rare as hell, but every so often, someone's mind stays asleep while their bodies just keep moving, like there's someone or something else at the wheel, like sleepwalking. And that's kind of what we think happened to Patty. That maybe she fell and bashed her head, and that's what brought her out of it. But all we had were guesses and theories, and none of us wanted to contact Patty's family out of respect for their privacy. I hoped that maybe they'd call one day and let us know how she was. But why would they? I was just the trail guide, and by the looks of things, they had way bigger fish to fry than checking in with me. I just wish I knew what happened to that poor lady, because sometimes thinking about that just scares the hell out of me. I'd been working as a wilderness guide out near Mount Shasta for about 3 months when I first met Noah. I'd moved to California from Minnesota, so I didn't really know anyone outside of my coworkers. And since the town is mostly a lot of tourists, I'd have to drive down to Redding to find people that weren't just working or passing through. And that's how I met Noah and her friends while hanging out and watching the Vikings at a bar. She was nice and really pretty too, with those deep brown eyes that she said came from the Italian side of her family. We swapped phone numbers, went for some coffee and drinks a few times, and then when things started getting a little more serious, coffee and drinks turned into longer and less public meetings. Noah thought it was cool that I got to work with nature, but it never occurred to me to turn a trail hike into a date. She lived down in Redding, and I preferred heading down there since she had a nicer apartment and a cat. And there was also way more to do down there, so in the end, it was Noah who asked me if she could drive up to Shasta sometime to check out the trails that I worked. Now, I thought it sounded like a great idea, and like I said, I was kind of kicking myself for not thinking of it sooner. She was super into nature, and so I could impress her with all of my accumulated knowledge, and it'd be cute to spend some time out there alone instead of surrounded by other people down in the city. She drove up to Shasta in the morning, and then after spending some time putting a little picnic together, we drove out to the trailhead near the upper sand flats and then hiked into the woods from there. The first thing I told her about, because the ladies always loved this one, is how old-timey prospectors used to keep ringtails as pets. A ringtail is a small rodent, kind of like a cross between a fox and a squirrel. They're very cute, and I strongly recommend that you Google them to see just how cute they are. But the miners didn't keep them around because they were cute. Oh no. They called them miners' cats because they were great at scaring off the rats that tried making their homes among the camp. I talked about how wolves had been reintroduced into the area and how it stabilized the deer population. Then I remember mentioning the prairie falcons and how they reached speeds of 200 miles per hour when they're dive-bombing prey. But one of my favorite little factoids, and one Noah loved too, was a behavior in black-tailed deer that we call flagging. And just like their name suggests, black-tailed deer have black tails, but only on the tops and sides. The undersides of the tails is the same color as their butts, a sort of off-white, and when they detect a potential threat in the area, their tails shoot up to show the white and then not the black side. And it's kind of like a collective traffic light, something that says, ready, steady before the go when the threat proves significant, and it's just one of many examples of how animals have developed methods of wordless communication. Now we walk for a few miles, with me dropping the aforementioned facts here and there, and then when we stopped for our picnic, I told Noah how Mount Shasta has its share of carnivorous plants, like the California pitcher. I also told her how growers have been trying to introduce the matsutake mushroom to the region, which is highly prized in Japanese cuisine. The only thing is, it can take up to a century for the fungus to form the symbiotic relationships with the pine trees that allow them to mature before fruiting. And that means that people trying to introduce will probably never even live to see the fruits of their labors. They're doing it entirely for the next generation, and we agreed that there was something very beautiful about that. And I remember at one point, Noah, who was having a great time, said something along the lines of, "Oh man, my dad would love this. We should totally bring him up here sometime." Now, I went quiet for what felt like the first time on the whole hike because she kind of casually let slip that I was the bring them home to dad type. Now, I was really into her, and so it felt amazing that she saw me that way. And then after pivoting towards family, we spent a little while talking about more personal stuff. Up until that point, it was probably the best date I'd ever been on, talking about something that I was passionate about, but impressing someone that I cared about all the while. But I had no idea at all how wrong things were about to go. And as the sun reached its peak and the day got to its hottest few hours, we were sort of taking on water like nobody's business. And so inevitably it came time for a little bathroom break. We agreed to walk off the trail in different directions, me taking on some trees on the left while she walked up this very steep slope to the right where it leveled off for a little more privacy from the trail. I figured that we'd be separated for a matter of minutes, and I also figured that I'd be done much quicker for reason of mail logistics, so I wasn't alarmed or anything when I got back to the trail and Noah wasn't there. But as the minutes ticked by and Noah still hadn't reappeared, I started to get a little worried. I took a few steps up the slope, not all the way as to impede her privacy, and then I called out her name and asked if she was all good. At the time, I thought I expected to hear her say something back, but I think looking back on it, it was more like hoped, because I remember that feeling of hope turning into this very rising panic when Noah didn't reply. It was dead silent from the top of that rise there, and it worried me so much that I walked to the top to see where Noah was. But when I looked, she was nowhere to be seen. Now, I think I hesitated for a moment looking at all the trees and bushes in front of me because it seemed totally logical that she'd walked off into the trees and out of sight to get her privacy. And it also didn't seem out of the question that she just didn't want to yell back at me because she was in the midst of peeing. I know that might sound dumb, but I was honestly just trying to rationalize the situation and not totally catastrophize it. But then looking back, I was a fool not to trust my instinct and go looking for her, because only seconds after calling out Noah's name a second time, I heard her scream. Now, without thinking, I started running in the direction of that scream before suddenly stopping myself. I dropped my backpack from my shoulders and was just totally frantic as I tore it open and went for the little pouch meant for my .45. I hadn't told Noah that I brought a gun with me. She was really anti-gun, so I didn't want to freak her out by announcing that I was carrying, but I also wasn't about to head out into the trail without a means of actually protecting us, so given the circumstances, you can bet that I was glad that I brought it. And I guess I should also make it clear how just from the sound of Noah's scream, I knew that she hadn't just sprained her ankle. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of terror, and I wasn't about to square up whatever scared her so badly without protection. I found the gun, and then went running off into the trees while calling out Noah's name. Now, I called out maybe 2 or 3 more times as I was running, but again, got nothing in reply, so I kept on moving through the trees with my head on a swivel, until suddenly, I saw her. Noah was being dragged along the forest floor by her hair, and the person dragging her looked normal. Now, remember this sort of split second thinking, total confusion almost as I locked eyes with the guy dragging her. I guess in my head, this guy should have looked like a monster. I mean, quite literally some big lumbering beast that was hairy and teethy and clawy, you know? But he didn't look like that at all because, like I said, he just sort of looked normal. He had a blue t-shirt on, khaki shorts, and then tan hiking boots with colorful socks sticking out the tops. He looked like your average hiker, completely unremarkable aside from the fact that he was dragging my date across the ground by the hair. We locked eyes, and in that split second, I could see how scared he was. All I remember thinking was, good, you should be scared, and then I aimed that gun at him and screamed at him to let her go. The guy looked terrified, but he didn't let go of Noah's hair. In fact, after maybe only a split second of him being still, he kept on pulling her like twice as hard. He was obviously trying to get away, but there was no way that he was about to outrun me while trying to drag a human body. The smart thing to do would have been to just let go of her hair and run, but he didn't. He was so fixated on her that he made this laughable, futile attempt to cart her away and escape. I mean, it might actually have been funny if he wasn't dragging Noah by her hair, but he was, so it was this weird combination of insane and horrifying to me. And with the gun still aimed at him, I yelled at him to let Noah go or I'd shoot. The guy stopped again and looked at me with that sort of same scared look in his eyes, and when he didn't let her go, I remember thinking, okay, it's happening. But then as I began to line my sights up on his chest and went to squeeze the trigger, I found that I couldn't actually do it. I felt the cold metal of that trigger on my finger, but right as I was about to pull it, it was like I heard this voice in my head yelling, don't do it. You'll hit Noah. And I knew that was possible, but given the relative position of her body to where this guy was standing, it'd have to either be the worst or the unluckiest shot in the history of firearms. I wasn't a bad shot either, like I knew I could have dropped the guy at those kinds of ranges, but like I said, when it came to pulling the trigger, I locked up in a way I never anticipated. And then when I locked up, the fear and doubt started to completely overwhelm me. I was frozen to the spot, not being able to shoot but not daring to lower my gun either, but the worst thing was, the guy could tell. He saw a fear bigger than his own reflected in my eyes, and when he did, I think it calmed him. He didn't smile or laugh or anything sinister like that. He just sort of turned his head to make sure that the way was clear, and then just kept on dragging this now semi-conscious but still weak Noah through the trees. But that spurred me into action. I still couldn't bring myself to take a shot right at him. I was just scared to, I guess. But what I could bring myself to do was warn him. Now, I can already hear all the ultimate badasses in the comments saying, oh man, such a pussy, couldn't bring himself to shoot a man to protect his girl. Well, while you might be the super soldier who inspired John Wick, I'm not him. And while you might be so skilled with a pistol that you give yourself prostate exams with them, and I'm sure you do, that's not me. And so the only shot that I knew would be 100% safe was a kind of warning shot above the guy's head, the kind that had absolutely zero chance of hitting either of them, and so that's what I did. I aimed higher and fired a warning shot that flew well above his head, but it was enough to make him jump and turn back to me with this look of absolute terror in his face. I yelled the only thing that came to mind, which was how if he didn't let her go, the next bullet was going to find him. And it was the only remotely badass thing I did during that whole encounter, and I guess it only worked because I needed it to, but it was effective. The guy then let go of Noah's hair, then turned and ran off through the trees. I immediately followed, rushing forward to where Noah was lying. At this point, she was half awake, coming to after having been hit pretty hard in the jaw with something. There was blood coming out of her mouth, her eyes looked like they were struggling to focus, and I had to support her after helping her to her feet. I put her back down again once we got to the trail, and then as she realized where she was and remembered what had happened, she just started crying. Since the cell signal was so shoddy on account of being relatively low altitude, I did the only thing I could do, which was try and console her. She kept going back and forth between apologizing and thanking me, and while I'm not sure what the apologies were for, she certainly didn't have to thank me. I told her it was okay, that the man was gone and he didn't seem to be armed, but that we needed to get her out of there to get her jaw checked at the hospital. We could move at whatever pace she wanted because I had my gun to protect us, but the longer we stayed, the more chance that he'd try and come back to find us. And maybe that time, he'd have something to fire back. We were up and moving again seconds later at a mixed pace of jogging and walking fast. I think all the heavy breathing brought Noah a kind of calm because before long, she was able to tell me exactly what had happened after we went off to pee. And even all these years later, thinking about it scares the hell out of me. So Noah said that she'd walked off into the trees at the top of the slope and then put enough of them between me and her to ensure that no one peeking up from the trail could get a look at her. She drops her shorts, does her thing, but then as she's buttoning them up again, she hears something moving kind of close to her. She stayed put and stayed quiet, and then when she heard me calling out her name, she was too scared to respond. She said it felt like the thing close to her was hunting her, and calling back to it would have allowed it to find her. But then seconds later, she hears a sort of thud of fast footsteps behind her, and then when she turns to look, bam. The first hit didn't knock her out, and that's when she screamed. The second one knocked her unconscious briefly, but by that time, help was on the way. I was worried that she might have a fractured jaw, maybe some kind of damage to her teeth, but luckily the only wounds were to the inside of Noah's cheek. She had some pretty nasty bruising on her face, and it took a while for the inside of her mouth to heal, but I'd say that she escaped some pretty nasty injuries. And if that guy had gotten her to wherever he wanted her, I'd say that she might have even escaped a fate worse than death, too. We obviously filed a police report at the Shasta Police Department that very same day, right after Noah was discharged from the hospital. It was stressful for her, really stressful, having to kind of relive those events so soon, but we agreed it was better to get it on paper while it was fresh in her mind. We thought it paid off too when the cops told us they'd arrested a guy. But after we drove back to the department and Noah checked out the guy's booking photo, we both agreed it wasn't him. The guy in the photo had a bunch of violent convictions, many of which involved female victims, but as much as we wanted it to be, it wasn't the same guy that attacked Noah. It affected her for a while after. Like she said she had nightmares about seeing the guy's face suddenly in places that she didn't expect it to be. I really felt for her, and I made myself available in every capacity I could. And then, as messed up as it sounds, it was that horrible event that brought us way closer together and put us on the road to where we are today. Me and Noah are still together, coming up on 7 years now, and this year I'm finally going to do the right thing and ask her to marry me. And maybe if you read this on your podcast, it'll be how she finds out what I'm planning. But if not, well, I'm sure I'll think of a way to ask the love of my life to be my lawful wedded wife. And so I can spend the rest of my life protecting her, the same way I did near Mount Shasta that day. Hey friends, thanks so much for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.